Okay, hello everyone. We're back and we're talking about chapter 20 today. We're talking about aggregate demand and supply. So this is actually, I think, the most interesting chapter in our in this course because it really gets at the heart of macroeconomic policy or monetary policy in particular, and it shows how economists try to manage the economy when we experience shocks, which is at the center of what macroeconomics is trying to manage the macroeconomy and make sure that it's moving smoothly and everything is going well. All right, so let's go into it. We're going to be talking about economic fluctuations or economic shocks, and we're going to talk about this model of aggregate demand and aggregate supply and how it can explain these fluctuations. And then we'll kind of teach you how to use a model and analyze shocks and how it will play out in the future. Okay, so we've seen that GDP grows at about 3% per year on average. That's in the US, that's in the developed world. Of course, we've seen in the developing world like China and Indonesia and those countries grow at a faster rate. But we know that generally GDP is growing, and we do experience recessions sometimes. And recession is going to be essentially a period of time where you have falling real incomes, meaning that you have falling wages or real wages, and rising unemployment. So, falling, you have a lower level of GDP and higher unemployment. And usually, to really be called a recession, you need to have 2 quarters of falling GDP and unemployment. And then depression is going to be just a really long recession that goes on for quite long. So this is a graph of GDP, real GDP. So this is adjusted for the price level. Remember the difference between nominal and real. And you can see that these gray bars in the graph are times of recession. So whenever you have a gray bar, you can see that real GDP does come down. You can see particularly in 2008, it's quite a large, much larger than the other recessions that we saw throughout time. And I guess this is why we call it the Great Recession of 2008, because it was quite large. And you can also see, it's interesting that it was knocked off. We were knocked off our path. If the US would have been at least, a little bit higher if we were on the same path, but, it really knocked us off for a bit and it caused our incomes to be lower. It was quite a large recession. Look at investment. Investment dips big time during recessions. You see these not so big in the past, but in 2008, of course, the Great Recession was quite huge. So we had a large dip in investment. The reason being is because, well, if a recession is here and people are a little concerned about the future, then why would anyone invest? Because we're a little unsure about what's going to happen, and as a result, no one wants to buy, invest, or build anything because it doesn't look like a really nice world at this moment. Of course, look at unemployment. Unemployment goes in the other direction. It skyrockets during recession. So whenever unemployment's low, whenever we have a recession, you always have an uptick in unemployment. And that makes sense because, well, it's a recession. People are losing their jobs, firms are shutting down, and as a result, you have rising unemployment. Okay, so we talked a lot about the classical dichotomy. It turns out that this is actually an important concept. And what this is saying is that, well, money has no effect on real variables in the long run. Okay? And that's a neutrality of money. The neutrality of money is saying that changes in the money supply affect nominal but not real variables. So that means that the real economy is unaffected by money supply or the price level in the long run. In the short run, that doesn't hold. When we talk about the classical dichotomy, is that, yeah, sure, prices and money affects nominal variables, but it affects nominal and real variables in the short run. In the long run, there's no effect. So what this is saying is that, well, if changes in nominal variables like the money supply or price level, if that can affect real variables, well, that's great. That means that we have a tool here. If I can change the money supply or the price level and I can have a real effect on the economy, that means that me as an economist, I have a tool in my hand to manage the economy. And that comes from the classical dichotomy. If the classical dichotomy was not true, or if the classical dichotomy held in both the short run and the long run, meaning that money supply doesn't affect the real economy in the short or in the long run, then I would have no tool. There'd be no point in doing anything. There would be no point in engaging in monetary policy because, well, monetary policy has no power over the real economy. But because we find that monetary policy does have an effect on the real economy in the short run, then we can engage in monetary policy. In the long run, does not have an effect. So if this is a little unclear to you, go back to the previous chapters where we talk about this, particularly the chapter on inflation, where we talk about the classical dichotomy. It's actually quite an important idea. And because of that idea is the reason why we can engage in monetary policy, because, well, changes in the money supply does have a real effect in the short run and short run only. So here's how we model this. Looks like a simple demand and supply graph, right? Downward sloping demand, upward sloping supply. The only difference here is that we're saying that this is aggregate supply and aggregate demand, meaning that we're just trying to sum up among all firms or all households to get this aggregate demand and aggregate supply curve. Just like supply and demand in a micro level, we also have P and Q on our axis. So P is going to be our normal y-axis, and Q here is, instead of quantity, well, it's kind of the same thing as quantity. We've got real GDP, and we said that real GDP is essentially output. And that's going to be a measure of how much stuff did we produce. So when we look at this graph and we see, aggregate supply, aggregate demand, P and Y, well, this isn't too different from our micro supply and demand graphs. The only difference is that, well, we have a Y here instead of Q, but they really represent the same thing, output and quantity. And then we have these aggregate supply and aggregate demand, but they behave in the same way as supply and demand in general. Okay, so let's look at the AD curve. The AD curve is quite important because essentially households live on this curve, and we demand or consume or invest and so on and so forth based on the price level. And what this shows is that, well, when the price level is quite high, our aggregate demand is quite low. Well, because things are expensive, and as a result, I can't afford to buy all of these things. But vice versa, when the price level is low, then my aggregate demand is quite high because, well, things are cheap, and therefore I can buy it. But the thing is, we're just talking about C right now. We're just talking about consumers, households. What about I and G and an X, right? All of these things are part of output, and it must be that prices has an effect on investment, government spending, and net exports as well, and not just on consumption. So this is the consumption, the wealth effect, right? How does P have an effect on C? And we said, well, the more expensive things are, the less I'll buy. The cheaper things are, the more I'll buy, because frankly, I'm wealthier when things are cheap. So that was the effect of P on C. All right, the effect of price on consumption. Of course, we said that, hey, well, Y isn't just consumption; it's investment, government spending, and X. So there must be other effects besides the wealth effect that affects these other things, and we're going to look at them right now. So let's look at the effect of P on I. So if we're saying that the price level declines, that means that things are cheaper in the economy. As a result, I have extra money, I have surplus money. And what do I do with that money? Well, in the absence of consumer stuff that I can buy, well, I'm going to also then buy investment goods. If I buy investment goods and I buy bonds and other assets, well, that's going to decrease the interest rate, because now I'm saying, if this is unclear to you, how did an increase in people buying bonds and other assets decrease the interest rate? Go look at the loanable funds market. We did this a few times in the past. And what you can see here is that we're saying that there's an increase in the supply of loanable funds, right? After I bought all my goods and services, and since these goods and services are cheaper, I've got some extra money, I might as well loan that money out or give it to somebody who wants to go and borrow it and give me some interest. And if the supply of loanable funds increase, you can go to the loanable funds market. You of course go to the graph of supply and demand, where you have on the x-axis Q, your quantity of loans, and on the y-axis is going to be the interest rate. This is something we've done in the past, and you should go look at if it's unclear to you. And so if we have an increase in the supply of loanable funds, that leads to a decrease in the interest rate, okay. If there's a decrease in the interest rate, that means that I need to increase my spending on investment goods, okay. That means that a decrease in P increases my investment. The reason being is because, well, the interest rate is lower. If the interest rate was 5% and now it's 2%, well, that's great. I want to go and take out that loan and invest in, my dream business, or burger stop, or a donut shop, or anything like that. And the reason why I'm suddenly now wanting to go and do that investment is because there's a decrease in the interest rate. So a decrease in interest rate leads to more investment. The reason being is because investment is cheap. It's very easy to go out and borrow and get some money and use that money to go and buy or invest in business as well. So we've seen here the interest rate effect, which is how a change in prices leads to a change in the interest rate, which leads to an increase in investment. Okay, and the increase in investment comes from the fact that, well, interest rates are really, really cheap. The cost of investment is low. All right, let's look at the last effect, and it's going to be the effect of P on net exports. And we're going to say that, well, if things in the US are cheaper, that means that the US interest rate is cheaper. We saw that from the last example. And if the interest rate is cheaper, we know that the US dollar will depreciate, right? This is the exchange rate. If this is unclear to you, again, we talked about this in the last chapter on trade, and how the effect of the interest rate has an effect on the exchange rate. So if we know that we have a decrease in interest rate, that causes a decrease in the exchange rate. And if the exchange rate is gone down, well, that means that American dollars are cheaper. And I can now, as a foreigner, buy more American goods. Not because we know that American goods are cheaper, but also the exchange rate has changed. And that means that I can exchange my money for dollars at a lesser rate, meaning that I can get more dollars. If I can get more dollars, that means I'll buy more American goods, and that stimulates net exports. So that increases the quantity of goods and services demanded from foreigners, from the net exports. And the reason being is because, well, prices are cheaper in the US, right? You can even start to look at it in a more direct mechanism by saying, well, things are cheaper in the US. Let's forget about the interest rate. Let's forget about the exchange rate. And we can just immediately say that, hey, that stimulates net exports because, well, now iPhones and Tesla cars are cheaper than they used to be yesterday. And then now I'm going to buy more iPhones as a result. All right. So all of this is to show that, whether it affects through C or through I or through NX, right? Those are all parts of demand from Y. And we've all seen, whether it's, CI or NX, a change in P does lead to a change in these things. And they change all in the same direction, whereas they're opposite. A decrease in P leads to an increase in C, an increase in I, and an increase in NX. Okay, so just like demand curves in general, always you move along the curve when you change one of the axes, right? When you move from P1 to P2, that's just a movement along the curve. When I move from Y1 to Y2, that's just a movement along the curve as well. So always you're moving along the curve when you change anything in the axis. Any change in the Y or X axis leads to just a movement along the curve. Everything else is going to be a shift, right? So that's how you determine whether I'm going to shift the curve or I'm just going to move along the curve. Well, you always just move along the curve when we just have a change in these two variables, or at least the variables that are on the axis, and everything else is likely to be a shift. Okay, and what you can think of as a shift, the way I like to think about it is that at the same price level, my output is just a lot larger. That means that nothing has changed, right? The prices are still the same, and suddenly I was producing $100 million worth of stuff. Now I'm producing 150. What gives? Nothing's changed. Well, maybe there's, something that's gone. Something has happened. In this case, we're saying that there's a stock market boom. And a stock market boom makes households feel wealthier. As a result, people consume more. And that means that at the same level of prices, people are consuming more. And that means that we have a higher Y, a higher output. And as a result, we have a shift in the AD curve to the right. You can even think about this in other aspects in terms of increases in I or increases in G or NX, okay? Where we don't change the price, okay? And we're going to change some other stuff. And we'll see some more shifts as we go along. But the point here is I want to make is that if we're not changing anything on the axis, P or Y, and something else changes, well, then now you should start to think, well, maybe this is a shift in the curve. And then you can start to rationalize which way and does it make sense and so on and so forth. All right, so let's talk about why the aggregate demand curve might shift. And the first one we talked about is that, well, maybe people are consuming differently. Maybe we have a stock market boom or crash. Maybe we have a changes in preferences. Maybe people are saying that I don't want to consume today, I want to consume in 10 years. I'm trying to save for the future. Maybe people are becoming like that. Or maybe changes in taxes. Of course, the obvious one that we can talk about today is going to be the coronavirus, right? Of course, people are consuming a lot less because of the coronavirus. They're saying that, well, we don't know what's going to happen. It's a pretty uncertain time and a little scary. So as a result, I'm not going to go out. I'm not going to buy. I'm not going to go. I can't even buy, even if I wanted. I can't go out to restaurants. I can't go to retail stores. I can't buy, new Nike shoes because everything is closed. And as a result, that changes C, right? And that would be a shift in the aggregate demand curve to the left. So right now, in the age of coronavirus, I'm confident that most macroeconomists are thinking that this is a shift in the aggregate demand curve to the left, or a decrease in aggregate demand. That would be step number one, at least in analyzing this corona crisis. But it's also not just a change in C, it's also changes in I, right? I think that this corona crisis is also decreasing investment because if you are an investor, maybe this isn't the right time to put your money in the market or put your money into building real assets or real investments or any type of store or shop. The reason being is because, again, there's a lot of uncertainty. We don't know what's going to happen. The economy's come to a halt. And, this corona crisis, even though, again, it's not a change in prices. The prices are still the same. Output is still the same. What's really only thing that's changed is that we have this coronavirus, and as a result, that's shifted the aggregate demand curve, particularly shifted it to the left because it's going to be a decrease in demand, not an increase in demand. So it's kind of like a stock market crash. So another thing that could change is expectations, right? If, for example, a political leader that nobody wants comes into office, and people expect that this country is going to go into trouble, that could decrease investment. People don't want to invest, say, in the U.S., or maybe if we're not happy with the Brazilian new president or new president of Brazil, maybe I won't put my money in Brazil. I won't invest in any Brazilian assets. So that can change investment as well, just by expectations, right? Of course, interest rates changes I. We know that, and this is actually the main mechanism, right? If interest rates are low, I'm going to invest a lot, right? Because it's almost free money. If interest rates are high, and that means that my borrowing costs are high, maybe I won't invest so much because it costs so much to borrow and take some money out. Of course, monetary policy changes investment, and we're going to see how that works. That works mainly through interest rates. So monetary policy affects interest rates, which affects I, and we'll see that a lot in the next few weeks. And of course, we can talk about some policies like tax credits or other tax incentive. And a good investment tax credit to think about here, though I like to mention a lot, is going to be tax incentives on renewables. The Colorado pays a lot of your investment taxes if you decide to build a solar panel on your roof of your house. And as a result, since they offer these type of incentives, right, these tax incentives to people, that means that I might have more of an incentive to go out and buy some renewable panels, right, and install it and invest it and install it in my home because, well, the government has given me the incentives to do that, right? So these are all ways to change I. Of course, we also have changes in G, right? So we can say that, well, if federal spending changed or state and local spending changed, that can change the G or the amount of government spending. So of course we do have changes in G right now because of course the government is issuing these $1,200 checks. So that's going to be all changes in G. That's federal spending right here. Another example to think of is, if you ever go into a war, right? If all of a suddenly you're thrown into a war and you need to spend on defense, you need to spend on airplanes and ships and rockets and so on and so forth. Well, that's going to be a change in G and so on and so forth. And then lastly, changes in net exports. Booms and recessions in countries that buy or export. So right now, for example, the US exports a lot to Mexico and Canada. And if Canada had a recession, that means that Canadians are no longer buying stuff because they have their own problems. Well, that means that hurts the US, right? So a recession in Canada decreases net exports, right? Or we can look at another way. What if, say, we can say a boom in Southeast Asia? What if, you know, the Philippines, Indonesia, and Thailand, all of these countries suddenly become huge consumption hubs, and they're buying all of these iPhones and all of these Teslas and all these American products? Well, a boom in Southeast Asia will cause a boom in the U.S. because, well, it booms net exports. Those countries are now buying more iPhones and more American goods, and that's good for America. Of course, and then the last part is going to be a change in the exchange rate, right? If the US dollar appreciates and the US dollar is very, very expensive, well, I'm not going to buy a lot of American goods, right? Because the exchange rate is so high. I have to change my money into these dollars, and I lose a lot of money during the exchange. So as a result, I can't afford to buy all these net exports, and vice versa. If we have a depreciation in the exchange rate, I might want to buy a lot of goods. So in terms of depreciation, I probably mentioned this last class, but I'll mention it again. There's also things called competitive devaluations, and that's actually happened, particularly in China, and I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 years ago. And what they did is that they competitively devalued their currency, meaning that they intentionally depreciated the renminbi, the Chinese currency, and they did that to boost net exports. They're trying to tell the rest of the world that, hey, you know, you thought Chinese products were cheap then, well, let me depreciate my exchange rate a little bit more and make it even cheaper for you as a foreigner to buy Chinese goods. And the whole point is that I'd like to boost Chinese net exports. I want the rest of the world to be able to afford Chinese products and boost net exports, and I can do that by depreciating my exchange rate. And China did do that. They devalued their currency a bit. They didn't devalue it much. I think it was about 20% devaluation. I'm not really sure, but they did devalue their currency in hopes to boost net exports and incentivize neighboring countries to buy Chinese products. Okay, so let's look at a few examples, and we're going to say there's 4 scenarios, and we're going to try to figure out how does the aggregate demand curve shift in each direction. So when we look at these scenarios, I want you to read them, and then the first question I want you to ask is it a movement along the curve? And if it's a movement along the curve, then that's it. You just move along the curve, and you say there's no shift here. If you determine that it's not a movement along the curve, then we can move into the next step and say, okay, well, if it's not a movement along the curve, then it must be a shift. Let's figure out which way it shifts, if it's a shift at all. Maybe you're right, it's not a movement along the curve, but it's neither a shift. It has nothing to do with aggregate demand. An example of this is going to say, well, what is the effect of changing political parties from Democrats to Republican have on aggregate demand? Well, it's not a shift in the curve because, it's not a movement along the curve because it's not a change in P or Y, but maybe it's a shift in the curve. But then you start to think, well, going from left to right or red to blue doesn't really change aggregate demand that much. So it's neither this nor that. It's not a movement along the curve or a shift in the curve. So you'll have to go through this way of thinking about it. Is that step 1? Is there a movement along the curve? If not, well, let's then talk about whether it's a shift along the curve. So scenario A says we've got a 10-year-old investment tax credit expires. So let's break this down. We're going to say that first of all, something expired, something that used to exist doesn't anymore. And what is it? It's an investment tax credit. So investment tax credit should help people invest, right? It's a credit against investment tax. So if it expired, that means that investment used to be lucrative, used to be something that was good and nice because we had this investment tax credit. It expired now, and as a result, we don't have this investment tax credit anymore. And as a result, investment is less attractive. Investment is less attractive, so that means that we are shifting the AD curve to the left. Of course, the first step to determine is that, well, first of all, is this a movement along the curve? Well, no, because it's not a change in P, and it's not a change in Y. Those are the things that are on our aggregate demand axis. So once we determine that, well, we can say, well, if it's investment tax credit and expired, that means that investment is no longer attractive. So investment will fall and aggregate demand shifts left. Scenario B says, well, what if the exchange rate falls? If the exchange rate falls, that means that there's a depreciation in the US dollar. And if there's a depreciation in the US dollar, that means US dollars are cheaper to find I can get them pretty cheap. And if I can get dollars pretty cheap, that means that I have a lot of dollars with me. I should buy American products with it. Let me go buy iPhones and Teslas and so on and so forth. And as a result, net exports rises and aggregate demand curve shifts right. And that's like the same thing with that competitive devaluation example that I just talked about in China. Well, the competitive devaluation says that, well, I'm going to devalue or bring down my exchange rate. And as a result, we saw that net exports rises. Okay, a fall in prices increases the real value of consumers' wealth. So first of all, we have a fall in prices. Okay, immediately I can start to say, well, a change in prices, that's just changing the y-axis in our aggregate demand curve. So that's just a movement along the curve, and I can just immediately stop there. I can say, well, there's no shifts here because, well, it's a change in the axis. It's just a move from P1 to P2, and that's just going to change our output. Just a movement along the curve. And particularly, it's a wealth effect because we're saying that it increases the real value of consumers' wealth. All right, and then the last one, we're going to talk about state governments replace their sales tax with new taxes on interest, dividends, and capital gains. So if there's used to be sales taxes, and now there's no more sales taxes. They've replaced those sales taxes with something else. If they replace their sales taxes with something else, that means that consumption is a little bit more attractive. When I go buy my Doritos or I go buy my Dr. Pepper at the store, I don't have to pay, a few extra cents on it. So maybe I use those cents to maybe buy some gum or something else. So as a result, consumption does rise and aggregate demand shifts, right? And that comes from the fact that, well, consumption is a little bit more attractive because I don't have to pay this extra sales tax to the government. Now, one thing that this example doesn't show is that, well, we also replace it with new taxes on interest, dividends, and capital gains. So it's going to also affect investment here, if you think about it, because sure, we replace this with that. Consumption benefits here, but investment hurts here. So you could also argue that, well, as long as it's true that C rises and aggregate demand shifts right, but by the same movement, we can say that I falls and AD shifts left. Right? IAD shifts left because investment fell. Why did investment fall? Well, because there are new taxes on interest, dividends, and capital gains, and investment is no longer as attractive as it used to be. Okay. So let's move on. That was the aggregate demand curve. We now saw how it's constructed. This is it right here. And usually we just move along the curve if we change P or Y. Otherwise, we need to determine whether it's a shift left or right. Now moving on to the aggregate supply curve, we're actually going to have two aggregate supply curves. And the reason being is because, again, of the classical dichotomy. The classical dichotomy says that, hey, in the long run, that's what these two graphs are. We've got the long run average aggregate supply and the short run aggregate supply. And we said that, hey, the classical dichotomy says that changes in P do not affect long run aggregate supply because of the classical dichotomy. Changes in P does not affect real variables in the long run. However, we saw that changes in P do affect short-run variables do affect real variables in the short run. So that's why we actually have these two graphs here. One where supply is invariant to P, meaning that aggregate supply doesn't care what P is. So that's why changes in P does not affect the real economy in the long run. But we saw that, well, actually it does change the real economy in the short run. So that's why we have these two graphs, or these two lines. So let's talk about this a little bit. So first of all, let's talk about the long run aggregate supply. And we said that, well, first of all, the long run aggregate supply is going to be at this Yn. Yn is going to be this natural rate of output. And this is going to be the amount of output the economy produced when unemployment is at its natural rate. Remember the natural rate of unemployment. And it's also called the potential output or full employment output, okay? I usually use potential output as well because this is potentially where we could be if everything was perfect, if everything was great and everyone had a job and we had unemployment at its natural rate, or full unemployment, right? Or full employment, sorry. Then we are producing at our potential, at our full potential, and that's why in the long run we should be at this yn. Okay, and notice that we said that over in the long run, this aggregate supply curve is not affected by P. It's really affected by human capital, natural resources, and capital. So that's why here Yn is determined by the economy stock of labor, capital, and natural resources, depending on the how many people you have, how much money you have, and your human capital as well, and your natural resources, and maybe even your level of technology as well. Like all of these things, which are going to be these factors of input, those determine where your potential output is going to be. Those determine what you're going to produce in the long run, right? Because prices don't have an effect here. Look, a change in price did not change where my potential output will be. What will change potential output is going to be changes in labor, capital, and so on. Yeah, so here, look at this next graph. What would shift the long-run aggregate supply? Well, changes in those factors of input, changes in my human capital, changes in my levels of technology, changes in my, what else do we have? Labor, capital, and natural resources. So maybe we discover oil wells, or we discover some gold mines or something like that. And as a result, that increases my natural rate of output over the long run. And this is all coming from the fact that, well, the fundamental inputs into the economy, whether it be land, labor, natural resources, so on and so forth, has either increased or decreased, leading to this change. Okay. So why would the long run aggregate supply curve might shift? Well, immigration, right? Changes in L meaning labor. If we have more labor or less labor, that would change our long-run aggregate supply. In terms of retirees, if suddenly all these people that used to be working now all of a sudden retired, that's a decrease in L. And maybe some government policy reduces the natural unemployment rate. So if we say that, well, we're trying to keep people in jobs, and that decrease the natural rate of unemployment, well, that would increase our labor and increase our long-run aggregate supply. But it's not just labor, it's also capital and H. H is human capital. So this is going to be capital, this is human capital. And we said, hey, well, if we have more factories and equipment and more stuff like that, that can shift our aggregate supply curve to the right. But also if we educate our laborers, we may get them, make them have college degrees, then that's going to increase our aggregate supply, long-run aggregate supply, because people are smarter, they're more capable, they're more productive. Or if maybe some capital, some K, or H, factories destroyed or people die by a hurricane, that definitely shifts our long-run aggregate supply curve to the left and decreases our natural rate of output. Okay, so yeah. So we've talked about changes in natural resources. So if you find some new mineral deposits, be it oil or gold or anything, that changes the long-run average supply curve. Reduction in supply of imported oils, that also affects your natural resources, availability of natural resources. And then of course, changing weather patterns can affect your natural resources as well, or at least, for example, your crop yield, right? That can definitely affect your long-run aggregate supply. And of course, changes in technology. If we have some new technology or technological progress, that should increase our long-run aggregate supply. So what's been happening over the past few years? First of all, we know that long-run aggregate supply should be increasing to the right because, well, human capital is getting better. We're educating our people more and more. We're getting smarter. We're accumulating technology. We're making better technology, so on and so forth. We're accumulating capital. We're building more factories, more offices, so on and so forth. And that moves the long-run aggregate supply curve to the right increasingly. But also, we also have increases in aggregate demand, right? We have increases in aggregate demand because we're increasing the money supply. And what we're doing is that we're trying to increase our output and increase our prices as well. Now, we don't want prices to increase too much or else we risk inflation. We don't want prices to go in a negative direction. So if we had said that, well, long run aggregate supply is going to increase, but we're going to keep aggregate demand at the same level and we're not going to shift aggregate demand outward, what we would have is we would have a decrease in prices over time. And if that happens and we have a deflationary spiral, and we talked about deflation, why that's sometimes dangerous. It's dangerous because, well, if you anticipate that things are going to get cheaper next year, then you're going to postpone all your purchases. You might not want to buy that car or that house because you know if you wait 6 months or a year, you might get a 5% discount on it. And as a result, deflation is a little worrisome for some economists because we feel that that could lead to an economic standstill. People won't buy stuff because they're just going to say, well, if I just wait, I'll get it a little cheaper next year. So as a result, we have an increase in long run aggregate supply, and as a result, we try to match it with an increase in aggregate demand, such that we keep the changes in price at around something manageable, 2% per year. That's our inflation target in the US, at least. Okay, so let's talk about why would the short-run aggregate supply curve be upward sloping? Why would changes in P change Y? And this is what we're going to talk about. There's going to be a few mechanisms. So here's how you want to determine this. Okay, you're going to say that, well, I'm at this equilibrium where my aggregate demand intersects both my long run and short run aggregate supply, and this is going to be my output, and this is going to be my price level, and I'm perfectly at my natural rate of output, and everything is great. Now, if we have a shift to the aggregate demand curve to the right, what you have is you're going to have your output be over here, but your long run output be over there. Okay, so there's going to be a difference, and the same thing with prices, right? So whenever you have changes in demand, that creates a wedge between where output should be in the short run or today and where it should be in the long run. So this graph, even though there's a lot of things going on, is your starting point to determine how changes in or economic fluctuations affects the economy. So let's see why, first of all, let's talk about why the short run aggregate supply curve is upward sloping. So first of all, we've got sticky wages, right? There's going to be a few theories, and the first one is sticky wages. And sticky wages says that, well, people have wages that are sticky, meaning that they do not change throughout time. They adjust sluggishly. And the reason being is because when you graduate, you go and you sign a contract. You say that, okay, well, my wage is going to be, say, $60,000 per year. And you sign that contract, and your wage is stuck at $60,000 per year for a few years until your contract expires, or you renegotiate your contract and you change or they give you a promotion, so on and so forth. So that means that nominal wages, they don't really change perfectly. They always adjust sluggishly. They kind of adjust from time to time, depending on I guess the mood of the firm or the mood of your boss, where they want to give you a promotion or so on and so forth, or whether you have the courage to go and renegotiate your wage. So that so due to labor contracts and social norms, that's why these things adjust sluggishly. So if it was that P is greater than the equilibrium price, okay, that means that the price of goods is greater than the price of equilibrium. This equilibrium price is going to be the price that I pay my laborers, I pay my workers. That means that my revenue is higher, but my labor cost is not. Oh, that's great. I mean, suddenly prices in the economy, say I've got a firm that sells laptops, and suddenly the price of laptops went up. There's an increase in P, but my price of labor stayed the same. And the price of labor stays the same because of sticky wages, right? Well, that means that my revenue is higher, but my labor cost is not. That means that my business is doing quite well because suddenly the price of laptops is higher, but my price of computer engineers is the same because of sticky wages. And as a result, a higher P causes a higher Y. How does that happen? Well, because now laptops are selling for more. If laptops are selling for more and I'm in the laptop business, well, I'm going to increase my output. I'm going to start to, ramp up production, or maybe open up another production line, because, well, there's more prices. And this is the fundamental heart of why the supply curve in general, whether it's aggregate supply or just supply, microeconomics type supply. Why is it upward sloping? Well, because when prices are higher, I'm going to supply more of it, right? And that's what we're saying. So a higher P does call for a higher Y. The reason being is because, well, my revenue is higher from selling the stuff, but thankfully my labors are sticky. My labor cost is sticky. So this is one theory, one way to think of why is short-run aggregate supply upward sloping. Well, because of sticky wages. If prices are higher and labor cost is not, then production is more profitable, and I'm gonna produce more, and I'm gonna create a higher Y. So here's another theory: sticky prices, right? And by the way, all of these you'll see there's a third one that all relate to stickiness, or basically the fact that prices don't adjust perfectly, or they take a little bit of time to adjust. And here what we're saying is that, well, if many prices are sticky in the short run, why are prices sticky in the short run? Well, if suddenly the prices of laptops change, well, I've also got menu costs. It's costly for me as a laptop producer to suddenly adjust all my prices of my products. And as a result, because we have sticky prices and there's going to be a change in the price, well, if P increases, all right, if the price of laptops increases, and that means that if I have menu costs and I cannot raise my prices, right? I don't want to change my prices for my products, even though they have, in fact, changed in the economy. Well, that increases demand for my product. That means that people are now buying my particular brand of laptops only because I didn't adjust my prices. Prices rose, laptops are more expensive, but because I'm a lazy businessman, I'm not going to raise my prices because of menu costs. I don't want to change my menus or the menu. And as a result, if I don't want to change my menu because I'm lazy, or I'm just don't want to do it, that means that I have low prices, or lower than my competitors. And as a result, that increases demand for my product. And as a result, increase output and employment. So a higher P is associated with a higher Y again, and this is nothing to do with labor, nothing to do with sticky wages like we did in the first example. This is now saying, okay, well, if you didn't like that example, well, how about this theory, right? If you didn't like the sticky wage theory, how about the sticky price theory? And that's saying that, well, if prices are sticky and there's going to be kind of this relative change between prices, well, that's associated with a higher Y. A change in P, higher P is associated with a higher Y. Let's look at one last one, and this was going to be a misperceptions theory. And this is just saying that, well, it's kind of confusing. We may confuse changes in P with changes in the relative price of products they sell. So that means that if a firm believes that its relative price is rising, it may increase output and employment. So that means that if prices in the economy rises above the equilibrium price, I may think, right? If I may think that my price is rising, and as a result, if I think that my price is rising, I may choose to increase my output and employment. So that means that a change in P can also increase Y. Now, again, what is this saying? This is saying that, well, I'm not really entirely sure whether is it my price that's rising or just the price of everything else in the economy that's rising. And as a result, it's kind of, I'm not really sure what's going on. And if I see other things rising in the economy, if I see the price of, say, desktop PCs, or if I see the price of smartphones increasing, and I might say, well, hey, if all these other things are increasing, then maybe the price of laptops is also increasing as well. And as a result, I may choose to increase my Y. All right, so all of this is trying to say is that, hey, our actual level of output, okay, is going to equal some deviation from the natural rate of output. So we're going to say that, hey, your actual level is going to be your natural level plus some deviation from the expected price level. So this is saying that means we should be around yn plus or minus some level, and that's going to be dictated by this, right? Of course, this says right now plus, but what happens when this value is less than this value? If P is less than PE, then this whole thing is a negative term, and now we have y equals yn minus something. So that means that this actual level of output can be above or below our potential output. We can be above or below our potential output. It can be higher or lower than my potential output based on this term right here. How far is actual prices from equilibrium prices, or at least expected prices? If prices are way higher than the expected price level, then this term is positive, right? If P is greater than PE, then this whole thing is positive, and that means that Y is going to equal Yn plus something. And that means that Y is higher than Yn, right? That means that our actual level of output is higher than our potential. We're supposed to be at 100 million. Turns out we're at 120. Why are we at 120? Well, because prices are greater than the expected price level. We can look at it another way. We can say that, hey, our potential output is $100 million per year. That's our GDP. But it turns out we're only produced 80. Why is that? Well, we can say, well, it turns out that this whole term was a negative number, and we had to subtract 100 minus something to get 80 on this left-hand side. Why are we lower than our potential? Well, we're lower because it turns out that the actual price level is less than the expected price level. And that's not good for the economy, because if the actual price level is less than the expected price level, that means that things are cheap, and that means that the supply side isn't going to be incentivized to invest or build stuff. So here's where we are. You can start to see that, well, when P is greater than PE, if this term is greater than this term, then this is a positive number, right? And we're adding to Yn, and as a result, our actual will be over here. So here's the region where price is greater than price equilibrium, or price expected, sorry. And if the actual price is greater than the expected price, then I'm somewhere over here, and you can draw a line, a vertical line over here, and you can say, well, actual output is right here. Look, actual output is greater than potential. It's greater than potential because, again, this term, which leads to this term being positive. Likewise, in the other direction, when P is less than PE, if you put a line over here, right, and we can say, well, price is going to be a horizontal line cutting this way, and this price happens to be less than the expected price, so we're over here in this downward world, or this lower area. And if that's the case, look, when price intersects the short-run aggregate supply curve, turns out that actual GDP is right here. So I want to point out the difference between Yn and Y, right? Yn is going to be our potential. This is where we're supposed to be if everything was perfect. But when things aren't a little perfect, when, for example, the actual price level is above or below the expected price level, then we have changes in my actual GDP. Then I diverge away from my potential. I'm supposed to be here if everything was great, but things, well, not great. Well, if everything was perfect and my expectations matched up with reality. But when reality doesn't match up with expectations, either it's higher or lower, then my actual output is going to be higher or lower, depending on where I am. All right. Yeah, let's finish off this last little bit, and then we'll call it a day. So over here, we're going to say that, well, these theories aren't great because, first of all, we know that sticky wages adjust over time, right? It's not sticky forever. It's only sticky for that brief period, and that's why, again, we talk about the short run. And then also misperceptions are corrected. So all of these theories that I just mentioned, whether it's sticky wages, sticky prices, or misperceptions, those aren't permanent, right? Those changes, they adjust over time, and they realize that they correct themselves. So that means that in the long run, the equilibrium price must equal the actual price, and that's why the aggregate supply curve is vertical. This is true in the long run because of these things over here. because sticky wages adjust and prices adjust and misperceptions are corrected, well, that means that finally the price should equal the expected price because all of these things adjust in the long run. In the short run, of course, it doesn't adjust because wages are sticking in the short run from year to year, and same thing with prices and menu costs and so on and so forth. But over a long enough timeline, maybe say 5, 10, 15, 20 years, well, eventually expected price will equal actual price. So that means that, hey, in the long run, we're right here, right? In the long run, price equals the expected price, and that means that y equals yn. So that means in the long run, we're going to be at our potential. But in the short run, maybe sometimes we're above, maybe sometimes we're below. You never know, depending on what's going on that time, or is there a corona crisis going? Is there something that's happening, and as a result, output may be above or below. So an example here is we'll talk about this a little bit, but you'll start to see that how changes in aggregate demand, which affects, change in aggregate demand, which is affected by the corona crisis right now, shifts the aggregate demand curve to the left, which creates a new price over here, which brings us down to this lower level of output, and we'll see that in next class. Okay. All right. So I'll stop here, and we will pick up in the next video.